As a food scientist, what are some things that genuinely worry you?
Something I look out for is food fraud. I think people assume that heavy metals are lecherous thing where they're forcing heavy metals into things like produce and baby food. And that's not true, except when it is.
People are claiming that there's wood pulp and wood shavings in shredded cheese, which has like a kernel of truth to it, right?
I see people washing cheese in order to remove the cellulose or the fiber, and then they like squeeze it out. To me, I don't know. I think the concept of washing cheese is just so like,
Yeah,
why
it's a
why
bit
wouldn't you just go get the cheese block and then shred that? It's really nice to be asked, such a variety of questions from someone who understands a little more about what food science is. I think a lot of people always ask me about the more depressing stuff.
You do a really good job online of calming down some of the moral panic that seems to be associated with the nutrition space at the moment and bringing, some sort of balance to, the food and nutrition environment. And you do that with your expertise as a food scientist. So first of all, what is a food scientist and what do you do on a daily basis?
Love this question because I think food science is still that's like my ultimate goal is to get people to even understand what a food scientist is. My school supervisor always told me that food science was an applied science. So anything that you learn in biology, chemistry, physics, those sorts of things, since you're working with food and since we have to feed the world, we're essentially taking those, maybe higher concepts and applying them to our everyday lives. So that's the number one thing I would say is food science is an applied science. But food scientists, I would sort of describe it as sort of the backstage workers in the theater of food. So you have maybe the chefs who are more like performers, you have nutritionists who are more like the organizers, and then the food scientists are the ones actually putting all the pieces together. So people who do product development, you've seen all these crazy new prebiotic sodas or weirdly flavored Oreos. Like those are all food scientists who do those jobs. In addition, like we also lurk in the back testing samples, making sure that there's nothing wrong with our food safety, with our food quality. So it's sort of like we're not very well seen by society because we sort of linger in the back. But ultimately, our ultimate goal is to keep the food system as safe and as well. I'd like to think and as fun and as innovative as possible. There's a lot of different jobs that you can do as a food scientist. Sensory science is even one that's really cool. So the possibilities are endless when you're working with something as ubiquitous as food.
So, I mean, I guess the job description, food science or food scientist, doesn't really do it justice. It's like calling someone a doctor, not knowing that there could be 100 different specialties. So, even within a food scientist job description, there could be so many different facets you could go into. And one of the things you mentioned there was these fancy new prebiotic sodas that seem to be all the rage. And this is part of a rising tidal wave of functional food and beverages. What do you think about these gut health prebiotic sodas? Because I see it as an interesting way to, continue that fortification of foods and drink that people like to consume, even if, they may not on their own be healthy per se. But I guess it's better to have a gut health prebiotic soda than a full sugar version of Coca-Cola, for example.
For sure. I think what's interesting about those products is I think they sort of target an innovation source that hasn't been quite there yet. So like healthy soda and like these sorts of health substitutes, I think fit more of a marketing niche rather than like necessarily being like an all-in-one health solution, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think using prebiotic sodas as a substitute for eating fruits and vegetables or other sources of fiber is maybe not the best idea. However, I think that these are a nice substitute for anyone who wants to sort of stray away, like you said, from like the full sugar. Something I think is really interesting is in terms of like use cases in product development, it feels like, especially pre-pandemic, we had all of these diet sodas and then we also have like the full sugar sodas. We don't really have anything in between. And I think that in general, the beverage market has really exploded in the past few years. Like that's basically what I would do during my one trip to the grocery store per week is I would always be lingering in the beverage aisle because I think in the past 5 years, the amount of beverages and types have really blown up, specifically because people are looking for this sometimes even mocktail inspired beverages. They're looking for something that's going to kind of satisfy this, like scratch this itch of having like a nice cold beverage by your side that's not alcoholic, that's not high in sugar, that's not, but also not like a diet soda necessarily, which can taste really harsh or really intense. So I think a lot of it is mostly just a marketing use case. And I also think it's so interesting that they selected prebiotics as this source. You know, we sort of see all these
Mm,
macronutrients flow through marketing throughout the years. Like right now, obviously, protein is the big one. And I think in like the 2010s, like yogurt and probiotics and kombucha was like the big thing. So then once kombucha became a more saturated market, it's like, what's next? So I think it's just this interesting mix of like marketing use cases as well as like health trends. And I don't even think people choose select it because they want to, you know, health max or anything like that. They
yeah.
kind of just want to have like an enjoyable beverage that doesn't make them feel bad.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in terms of like everything you've outlined there, from high protein to probiotic enriched products and food compounds. Prebiotics probably are the one thing that have the most deep evidence base behind it if you look at that gut health section compared to probiotics. Like, the average person would more likely benefit from prebiotics than probiotics, for example. And if you add prebiotics to soda, it is most likely real fibers that are in there. So, in the worst case, it's not going to harm anyone by getting an extra few grams. I did find it interesting, however, that as a gut health product, and given that one of the most common symptoms that someone suffering with gut health problems would be suffering with was probably bloating, soda seems a very curious choice to promote as a gut health product, because carbonated beverages isn't going to improve someone's bloating.
That's a great point, and I love that you brought that up. I think, truth be told, I think it's like I said, like, it's the use case. It's the fact that you get
Mm,
to drink it and you don't have to chew it. I
yeah.
think we've all had that moment where, you know, eating a salad is great, but sometimes it's like 5 minutes until your lunch break ends and you're still chewing. So I feel like it probably targeted this convenience market as well in terms of this health convenience market.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. And I think actually that's the probably the biggest case you can make for some of these supplements, right? Because even with protein shakes or protein rich products, sometimes you don't want to eat a chicken breast or eat a plate of beans. You just want the protein or the fiber without any of the calories, without any of the prep or chewing. And you just want something convenient that's just direct 10, 20 grams of protein or fiber, right?
For sure. And something I think about a lot, at least in terms of protein specifically, is for folks who are, I made a video about this, about the most fun people, most fun audience to make food products for is bodybuilders and vegans, because they just want like their macros packed into whatever package they want.
Mm.
So if you think about someone like a bodybuilder who's eaten the same green beans, chicken, and rice for the past however many years they've been lifting, to have something that's, like, a little bit different and shakes it up, I think really, really makes them excited about, like, the variety that they can have in their diet. Like, at my local gym, there's a vending machine, and one of the products is, like, a protein chocolate, like, not cinnamon bun, but, like, a bun. Obviously, it's hard as a rock because it's mostly protein, but I've tried it, and it was pretty good, and it's I just find it really interesting what we can really do with food technology in order to help with, like, functional health.
Yeah, I also must say, I must admit, like I am guilty of trying to protein max with some of these things. I mean, I never, in all my years when I was a kid till now, thought that when I'm 35 years old, I would be eating protein crisps. But, I find myself on a weekend now and then having a bag of protein chips with 10 grams of protein. Who would have thought?
I know, it's pretty wild, and I have to say, like, there were some dark times, I think, for vegans and weightlifters in, like, the '90s and the 2000s in terms of their options, so I feel like for anyone who's coming into those 2 types of communities right now, it's probably super exciting to actually have stuff that tastes good instead of, like, a brick of textured vegetable protein.
Oh yeah, and on that topic of protein powder that you brought it up, there was a recent article that claimed that a lot of these protein powders, particularly the vegan products, the plant-based ones, and the organic ones, had high levels of cadmium and lead and other heavy metal contamination. How concerned does someone have to be about those sort of claims, or is it more unwanted furor and panic rather than what the truth actually is?
Well, I guess my maybe devil's advocate answer is that it's both. I think the biggest misunderstanding about heavy metals is that 100% of the time they're purposefully in the product, which is true occasionally, but most of the time it's important to understand that heavy metals like cadmium, lead, arsenic, mercury, they are naturally present in our Earth's crust and also in our soil. So basically, anything that you get from the Earth will have some level of heavy metals in it. And the important thing about heavy metals is that they're very difficult to remove from our food system. It's not like we have like specific magnets that can just suck them out. They're usually in very, very, very small doses. However, in terms of removal, we don't have the technology yet to necessarily like suck it right out of the product while not affecting the product in like an increasingly significant way. However, I remember when that chocolate protein study came out, it was measured, I believe, under Prop 65 guidelines. So in the state of California and in the United States, Prop 65 is a law that is in place since the 80s where you're required to declare cancerous items, so things like heavy metals or acrylamide at certain levels called the safe harbor levels. And what's important to recognize is that if you see like a Prop 65 notification, these safe harbor levels are at much lower levels than what's permitted. So they're usually sometimes almost 1,000 times lower than maybe the maximum RDU amounts. So I think a great example of this in terms of something that's maybe not as, heinous is seaweed. Seaweed is grown in the sea, and because of the seawater, there's high levels of arsenic, there's high levels of cadmium. So if you're going to go get dried seaweed at the store, even though it's a product that might only have one ingredient, it might have this Prop 65 label
Mm.
on it that says, do not consume because it contains heavy metals, it might be cancerous or hazardous to your health. It's because of this like arsenic accumulation in the water. However, it's not at a level that is so significant that it is above like the actual maximum daily allotted amount in the United States. It's usually 1,000 times lower than that. So the difference between it going just a little bit higher versus being 1,000 times lower and having it a little bit higher, it might already be way lower than the maximum amount. So that protein study test was conducted with those in mind. And those are much more strict levels. And you might say, like, well, maybe I'll avoid it anyway because I don't want to eat any heavy metals, which is, of course, your prerogative. But it's definitely nothing to be concerned about because we already set our heavy metals levels so low.
I guess, given that we are dealing with these heavy metals in our daily lives from fruit and vegetables that are grown in the soil, we accept that there are acceptable, safe doses of these present in our natural interactions. And, we just have to be, aware of that. Something similar to that found obviously in the sea would be, things that we eat that are derived from the sea. So seaweed, as you mentioned, fish products as well, which would be contaminated potentially with small amounts of mercury or anything else in the sea. On the other hand, we're also told that we should be consuming more omega 3s. And a lot of governments recommend at least two pieces or more, or two portions or more of fatty fish per week to get our omega 3 allotment. But at the same time, we also get these sort of contradictory warnings that if you eat a lot of tuna or eat a lot of salmon, you could accumulate excessive mercury. But how worried does the average person have to be about, mercury overconsumption or accumulation if they're having, I don't know, a tin of tuna a week or salmon 3 or 4 times a week?
I think it's great that we're talking about this because it sort of perfectly phases into the protein conversation we were just having earlier. I think canned and packaged tuna is a huge source of easy protein for folks because you don't have to necessarily cook it. Now it comes in a lot of really great seasonings or olive oil, and it's really just really quick on the go kind of protein. But I would say for me, these fishes that are higher on the food chain, so tuna being one of them,
Mm.
they're more likely to be higher in mercury. So I don't want to. I also have to say right here is that I'm a food scientist and not a nutritionist. So I do not have the ability to medically prescribe people. However, if you look at your state or federal guidelines, I think most of the time they don't want you eating a packet of tuna a day. That would be quite a lot. I do know that maybe some folks who are listening to this who are, trying to get their protein in might be like, "Ugh," but tuna every single day, I would not personally recommend. I don't think it's necessarily something where if you have been doing that, that you have to freak out all of a sudden. But it is something to sort of take into consideration that eating tuna is a marathon and not a sprint. Other fishes like salmon is more. A fish like salmon is a little bit lower in mercury because they aren't as high on the food chain. And there's also documents that you can look up to see which fish are more high in mercury. So a lot of these fish that are really, really high in mercury that could be potentially dangerous are, like I said, like fishes higher on the food chain that are not necessarily eaten in everyday life. So I think shark is one of them. I don't want to guess what everyone's cultural cuisine is, but I don't know a ton of people who eat shark on a daily
Yeah,
basis
me
or even a
neither.
weekly basis. So, that's why something like, I think that's also why sardines are so popular is because they're lower on the food chain. So
Mhm.
they do have lower levels of mercury. But if it comes from the ocean, it's likely to have some level of heavy metals in it. Like I said, even with the seaweed, which is technically sort of like the lowest thing on the food chain if you really want to think about it. So,
I guess, a lot of the conversation online, sometimes the facts get distorted. Even if they are true facts, they sometimes get distorted into something which is fear mongering and incites more panic. And one example that you highlighted recently online was about the topic that people are claiming that there's wood pulp and wood shavings in shredded cheese, which has like a kernel of truth to it, right? So these sort of cellulose is added to it to essentially stop the cheese clumping together. Can you expand a bit more about that? So why it is sort of true, but also why we shouldn't panic about cellulose or wood pulp in our cheese?
for sure. And this is specifically in pre-shredded cheeses. If you're getting
Mm.
like a block of cheese or, yeah, just like a big chunk of cheese from your grocery store, it's likely not to have this in it. So it's sort of this brilliant way of selling fear to you. I think that's what it is it sounds like that they're just like putting sawdust or like filler into our food. I think because folks who haven't worked in the food industry, or folks who just aren't that close to how food is made, which is, I would say, a lot of us, don't see the behind the scenes of it all. And food companies definitely keep that under lock and key because they have to preserve the secret sauce from their competitors. So it makes sense why, topics like this are such a black box for consumers and it's easy to believe these sorts of scary stories, especially since what we usually hear about food is scary things like recalls and outbreaks. So cellulose is an anti-caking agent in cheese, and what that basically means is when you buy the bag of shredded cheese, you want to make sure that it doesn't clump into one giant chunk because you're trying to buy shredded cheese. You're trying to have the shreds be, you can feel it in your hands, you can, sprinkle it over stuff. If it was all in one chunk, then you'd just buy the block of cheese. Cellulose is a really very ubiquitous structure in plants. If you've eaten spinach, if you've eaten any leafy greens, really any greens in general, you are eating a ton of cellulose. It's essentially basically a type of fiber, and fiber is not digestible, which sounds scary, but that's the whole point, is because it's basically in a rudimentary term supposed to push everything down that's already in there. So you also might see other anti-caking agents in your cheese like potato starch, cornstarch, calcium sulfate. And these are all like food safe ingredients that have a purpose in terms of basically just keeping your cheese shreds separated. I will say for folks who love to cook and want to make sauces out of shredded cheese, it's actually not the best choice because when you add things like starch into a sauce, it can easily break it or change the structure. Basically, you're adding in something that could potentially gelatinize. So, as you're heating it up, that's why you might notice the way that shredded cheese melts is just slightly different than the way, you know, freshly shaved cheese melts. And I think for folks who make nachos in their microwave, like me sometimes, I'm cool with it. But for folks who are really trying to make like a legitimate sauce out of this, I wouldn't recommend it as like the best choice in terms of their own food technology. But in terms of health, I think there's literally nothing wrong with it. People were even, I made a video about it. People were joking in the comments, like, now I have extra fiber in my diet, which it's such a low concentration that wouldn't even be the case. So that's another reason is like the dose always makes the poison, quote unquote. And cellulose isn't really even poison necessarily, but it's put in at such a low percentage rate that it's definitely not going to affect your health in any means necessary.
And for those people who maybe have been taken in by this fear mongering and then have begun to wash their cheese, that can actually add a bit of insult to injury because the moisture that then remains on the cheese can increase the amount of bacteria that can grow and mold and actually cause foodborne illnesses.
Yeah, I would say that, we've all had that block of cheese in the back of our fridge that's gotten moldy from sitting there for too long. And I think if you're to wash, I'm just, to me, I don't know. I think the concept of washing cheese is just so like,
Yeah, it's a
why
bit
wouldn't you just go
disgusting.
get the cheese block and then shred that? Like, I don't know. There's something kind of icky about it, I guess, in my opinion. But I see people washing cheese in order to remove the cellulose or the fiber, and then they like squeeze it out. And then if you're not going to immediately use that, if you have something that's super liquidy and fatty and full of all this good food that bacteria want to eat, then you put it back in the fridge, and mold growth is definitely imminent in a much faster amount of time than usual.
And I'm sure everyone has done this at some point growing up, or at least someone in their family has, or their parents have, is when they see a food product like a block of cheese, like a block of cheddar cheese, for example, and it has a little bit of mold on it, they would just slice off that bit of mold and continue to eat the cheese. They would do the same to scrape off that bit of jam or marmalade that has a bit of mold on it. Same with bread. And I've certainly done it growing up as well. And it was very late in life that I actually found out the science behind why you shouldn't just scrape off the mold from the cheese or throw away that one piece of toast in the loaf of bread that's moldy, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's the tricky part about mold is it does a really great job of showing you where it is. So, it'll go, "Hey, it's me. I'm mold." But the thing is that there's all of the other mold that is in such a is not perceivable by the naked eye that has basically gone everywhere. It's feasting upon your food before you even got to it.
Yeah, and so actually, it's invisible to the naked eye. So if you see visible mold, that means it's probably spread through the entire food or bread, loaf, or jam that you've wanting to save. But actually, the whole thing becomes pretty much unsafe, right? Unless it's a really hard cheese or a hard fruit, you could maybe take the risk. But I guess why would you?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I think we've all taken risks like that before where we've eaten the other side of the loaf of bread before. However, it's definitely not something I would recommend. It's more pervasive than we can see. That's for sure.
So I guess, I don't know, like a lot of people seem not to be aware of general food safety practices. Like what we just outlined there is one small example where, okay, most people have probably scraped off a bit of mold from a piece of fruit or some food and been totally fine, right? So it's not going to kill you if you consume a bit of mold on average. Like the chances are quite low. But I guess food safety practices and food hygiene is just about reducing the odds of an event.
For sure. Yeah. Food safety, I think, is one of those practices that has become very underrated in the home, in my opinion, or at least just in general. I think we like to underestimate how much bad foodborne illness can give us. We sort of just think of it as, maybe 8 hours of not feeling really great and then just sort of getting over it. But a foodborne illness has the capacity to really, really, really hurt you in a very intense way. But there's a lot of things that you can do at home that once you add them to like your cooking practice or your daily food prep practices, that it makes things a lot better. And I think the number one kitchen tool that I think is really underrated is a food thermometer.
Oh,
Um, it's really good to use a food thermometer. I think we've all been there where we have baked chicken or cooked chicken and we just are cutting open every single piece to check make
yep.
sure if it's done. Um, which on one hand, since you're opening up the surface area to more heat, then you might actually ruin the texture of your chicken just checking to make sure if it's safe. In addition to that, like chicken can carry Campylobacter, which is a type of bacteria that can cause pretty intense foodborne illness. So it's just best to cook your chicken to 165. Honestly, the best thing that you can do is just print out a big sheet of foodborne illness, like kill temperatures.
Mm,
But 165 is sort of the ideal kill temperature if you're taking away anything from this, that is sort of like the number one stuff things for chicken. If you're cooking like a medium rare steak, it might be a little lower, like 145, but using a food thermometer will take all of the guesswork out of that. And I
mm.
think it not only keeps you safe, but it also makes your cooking better. Cause like I said, like you can actually take the meat out or take whatever it is that you're cooking out before it gets overcooked or undercooked.
In a similar vein, another sort of important food safety practice is about the consumption and storage of leftovers. And I remember in my medical school days, if it was in the fridge for a week, it would still be good to go to eat. But, that's probably not the case. And there's a lot of foods that I didn't realize until very late in life that actually you can freeze, like things like rice and bread and other starches, sauces, soups, even. And so I feel that a lot of people don't really fully understand how long you can safely leave something in the fridge before consuming it, but also the increasing use of how we should be using our freezers for stuff that we maybe don't want to use now.
For sure. So I think it's recommended that leftovers only stay in your fridge for up to 3 to 4 days. I do think that can be a bit short depending on what kind of leftovers you have. There are some foods that are higher risk and some foods that are lower risk. And I also think if you're, purchasing something from the grocery store, let's say a bag of spinach, that bag of spinach will maybe have a use by date. You can follow that use by date. I guess that's technically not leftovers, but that's
Yeah.
definitely something to take a look out for. But if you have cooked some leftovers, I would recommend, maybe about 4 days. I would check in on that again because it might not be great. And then after when you have leftovers, I recommend also heating it to 165, the temperature I referred to earlier. So if you're heating in the microwave, like go for it, I guess. I like my food really hot, so I guess that's also
Mm.
something I'm just sort of biased on. Um, and yeah, like you said, like utilizing the freezer, once you like access the freezer, like your brain will explode with how many foods that you can keep safe because it's sort of interesting that if you keep bread on the counter, it'll last. If you keep bread in the freezer, it'll last. But if you keep bread in the fridge, it will not last. And
Mm.
that is because the fridge is usually around 4 Celsius or 40 Fahrenheit in the fridge because the fridge is a much more moist environment than the freezer, which is so low in temperature, the chances of your bread molding is actually much higher than if you were to just leave your bread on the counter or put it in the freezer. Honestly, my number one tip is if you see it stored a certain way in the grocery store, that's usually the way it's meant to be stored because they are
Mm.
trying to preserve freshness. So just copy whatever your local grocer does. But yeah, I freeze my bread, I freeze rice. I think another one that's super underrated, which is not super for food safety, more for food quality, is freezing mixed nuts or any types of nuts
Ooh.
that you have because nuts can turn rancid due to oxidation over time. It works for things like pine nuts if you like to make a lot of pesto. That's like sort of my fun tip.
So technically, as long as you don't experience any power cuts and the temperature of the freezer remains stable, any food items you leave in the freezer is technically food safe forever.
Yeah, I think it would be if it, like you said, like if as long as there's no power cuts slash as long as your freezer is not super wonky. I think we really
Yeah.
underestimate how much temperature changes go on in our freezers at home. Or we're not working
Mm.
with like industrial equipment here. But yeah, essentially, in terms of food quality, though, that's like another thing because obviously we know about freezer burn and I also think it's good to do like an audit of your freezer, like every so often, because sometimes you go back there and you're like, I don't even know why I put this in here. It's already encrusted in ice crystals. I'm good.
Now, on that topic of safety, something we saw in the early part of the 20th century, sort of in the early 1900s, was a huge problem with iodine deficiency, thyroid problems, people developing large, neck swellings because of thyroid goiters and thyroid disease, caused by iodine deficiency, which led to iodine fortification of table salt. And most people throughout the 1900s had table salt, which had that sort of extra iodine, which also helped with IQ levels as well as thyroid problems as well. But iodine deficiency is still a major global burden to this day. And we're also seeing this rise of fancy bougie alternative salts again, pink Himalayan salt, Celtic sea salt, and all these other fantastical things which claim to offer, a sort of fairy dust of other nutrients, but they are lacking in iodine, which is probably one of the main salts that we still do need.
100%. And I think it's kind of funny because I went to Costco the other day and they have like a massive thing of sea salt, but they don't have it for iodized salt. So I think it's become so popular and it also sounds a lot more romantic, to get salt from the sea or the Himalayan
Yeah.
pink salt. It sounds like it's been harvested from, kind of a magic mountain scenario. So and people just like stuff that looks pink. It's fun.
Yeah.
But iodized salt is one of the biggest public health like initiatives ever. 2 billion people are still iodine deficient. That's like
Wow.
one in every 4 people in the world. And it's also I think it's I think it's well known as one of the cheapest public health initiatives. I think it only costs each citizen about 5 cents a year. And it's just something that you can very easily add. And I think there's also this misconception of, well, I don't use iodized salt at home, but that's okay because of all the food I eat that has salt in it, it probably is iodized. But I would say 99% of processed foods do not use iodized salt.
Wow.
And this includes, people think of processed foods just as like chips, candy, all these other things, but it also could be, you know, frozen seasoned chicken or frozen seasoned vegetables. So iodized salt is not very commonly used in the food industry. So if you have the chance, I would definitely purchase some iodized salt to use in the home because iodine is such an important mineral that we lack and we're still very deficient in it. And like you said, there are actually studies that it can raise your IQ and it also affects your thyroid. And I don't think anyone wants a goiter in this day and age. It feels like one of those old school things like riding in a horse and buggy. I don't think we want goiter or that.
Do you think that more people potentially, given the state of our overconsumption of ultra processed foods, which is high in fat, high in salt, more people could do with maybe swapping their regular salt for the low sodium salt? That's like the potassium chloride rich one.
I think so. I think for folks, especially who are concerned about things like kidney stones or just their salt levels in general, blood pressure, that sort of thing. I think we call it light salt. I've actually
Mm,
used it before in certain lab settings. It's usually 70. I think it's 70% sodium chloride and then 30% potassium chloride.
yeah.
But it's a good way of sort of reducing your overall sodium levels. But I also think for a lot of folks, sodium is, such an essential mineral of life. As you know, as a doctor, like it's an electrolyte. It's in things like liquid IV, these sorts of workout supplements. If you're someone who exercises a lot or does a lot of physical activity, maybe you're a blue collar worker, you definitely need sodium in your life. It really powers almost every part of your body. So, and same with potassium. But I don't think sodium is one of those things where it's just like anything we deal with in the food industry, it's all a balance. It's not necessarily something you should 100% avoid because we need it, but it's also not something that you should overconsume on because it can cause all of these other issues.
Now, we've obviously touched on a lot of things which incite fear and panic unnecessarily. But as a food scientist, what are some things that genuinely worry you and that we maybe should be concerned about when it comes to either food safety, how we cook things, and generally how we interact and consume with foods?
For sure. Well, obviously, my number one food safety tip is to wash your hands. It's really crazy how washing your hands is like such an insane public health miracle. To be honest, there are no miracles in science, just very boring applications. Something I'm concerned about as someone who works in the food industry, for sure, though, is something I look out for is food fraud.
Mm,
So, sort of tying it back into our conversation about heavy metals, I think people assume that heavy metals are this sort of lecherous thing where they're forcing heavy metals into things like produce and baby food. And that's not true, except when it is. I think very commonly spices are adulterated with heavy metals. And
wow.
the reason why this is because, something like turmeric, which has such a strong color, you have to basically make your weight. So if you're selling zero point 0.3 grams of turmeric in a plastic container and you can't make the weight, like you just don't have enough, they might end up adulterating it with things like lead chromate, which is very
Yeah.
dangerous. So it's one of those things that's also sort of hard to. It's not necessarily hard to catch, but it's not as obvious. So for any folks who work in, like I said, in the food industry is like a supply chain web that you can't even fathom. So all these folks who are working in different parts of the supply chain have to be super resilient and know what to look out for, and also know that the supplier or manufacturer that they're working with is legit. And this is why stuff like FDA oversight is good, is because if we are importing certain things, then the FDA will inspect these imports and go, I'm putting on an import alert because there's something wrong here. There's something wrong in this food. It's been adulterated or misbranded in any way. So this is why like so much of the work that food scientists do behind the scenes is to keep us safe and to keep us from purchasing adulterated foods. Food fraud can also be very benign. I think a very common one that people hear about is olive oil. A lot of times olive oil is spiked with
Mm.
something like vegetable oil or canola oil that's dyed with chlorophyll or something else. So, for a lot of the more higher end olive oil companies, they do pretty rigorous testing to make sure that that's not the case. But food fraud is definitely a huge concern, and it's something that keeps me driving towards being a better food scientist, just to make sure that everything we have on the shelves is 100% legit.
Would you count fake sourdough bread and fake kombucha as food fraud, or is that just overzealous marketing sometimes?
Well, if it can be written on the label, usually it's overzealous marketing. Food fraud is a lot more nefarious. Uh,
Hmm.
but kombucha, a lot of it is pasteurized, so
Yeah.
sometimes you're not necessarily getting like live probiotics. It's just a bunch of dead bacteria corpses floating around in there. But that
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily make it not kombucha, if that makes sense. It's not
True.
being
True.
adulterated with anything. It just might not be exactly what you think it is, which is unfortunate.
So, is there anything like I know you mentioned before that an essential tool that people should consider having at home, which I certainly don't have, but I will after this, is getting a thermometer to check the cooking temperatures of any meats that you're cooking. Is there any other sort of interesting hacks or useful tips for either home cooking, cooking devices, or general food safety at home that you'd advise?
So obviously, I don't want people to break the bank or anything, but I think one of the most underrated kitchen tools is like a sous vide or an immersion circulator.
Okay.
So it's basically, there's a few different ways that you can get one, but the one that I have is basically just this big like stick, like this big metal rod that I stick into a giant bowl. And sous vide or immersion circulation cooking is amazing because if you love to make like salmon or medium rare or medium steaks, what's so great about it is the way it's cooked is you place the meat in a bag, usually vacuum seal it or remove all the air. You put it in a water bath and then you put the immersion circulator in it. And then it heats up the water to cook around the meat. And since
Ah.
water is such a better carrier of heat than air is, you basically get a 100% guaranteed even cook on that. So what's so fabulous about it is that if you like again, like I think it's the perfect use case for steak. If you love steak and you need to have it at that correct temperature, you can just leave it in your sous vide for about an hour, 2 hours or more. It will be perfectly cooked end to end. Center will still be pink, outside will be good, and then you just have to take it out, sear it on both sides. You have like a
Ooh.
perfectly cooked steak. It's honestly kind of a huge game changer for me. It also is great for busy people. It sort of has like a crock pot as quality where you can just kind of leave it cooking for sometimes up to 4 hours. So if you like really well cooked meats without having to worry about the temperature, that's definitely one of my favorite kitchen tools.
Okay, I thought I was changing the game with my air fryer and with my slow cooker, but I think I need to go and get a sous vide now. Wow.
Don't rush it, but it's something I'm really biased about. And you can make hard boiled or soft boiled eggs in there. It's crazy.
Ooh. Wow. I think first of all, I think, yeah, more people should know about the role of a food scientist and the number of different roles that they occupy in the food environment, right? Right from the sourcing to the testing to the actual manufacturing of our favorite products. I mean, sometimes the way they taste, they snap, sound, and smell a certain way is down to food scientists who sort of micro engineer all components of it. And also, like you just did today, explaining the different myths and not to worry. So thank you so much for joining us. And I think that we've just scratched the surface, and I think we need to have you back for round two sooner rather than later.
I would really love that, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. It's really nice to be asked, such a variety of questions from someone who I feel like understands a little more about what food science is. I think a lot of people always ask me about the more depressing stuff, like foodborne illness or food safety. But for me, I think what's so great about food scientists is and food science is that there's just so much fun behind it. I mean, I've worked in a chocolate factory. I've worked in kombucha. I've worked in so many different things. And I think food is just one of the greatest pleasures of life. And I think the
Hmm.
science behind it and diving deep is really just such a wonderful field of study. So, a very underrated in my opinion. So I just really appreciate the chance of getting to have this platform.
Yeah, I can tell you're super passionate about it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. But don't ask me if I'm good at cooking.